What's up guys, Dan Furlani here and welcome back to a new video. If you're new to this channel, there's one thing you need to know. I make videos with the Canon EOS R, the Canon 90D and the Canon M50, tutorials, reviews, vlogs, a lot of things. So if you subscribe, don't forget to activate the notification bell. That way you won't miss any of my future videos. Today I want to talk about different ways to shoot in slow motion with your Canon 90D and Canon EOS R. The best way to do that, well at least according to my taste, is to shoot in 120 frames per second. The results are awesome from both cameras, even though some of you may say, but the Canon EOS R, when you shoot in 120 frames per second, is in 720p, while the Canon 90D is 120 frames per second in 1080. Well, here I have to say that even though it's 720p from the Canon EOS R, it doesn't look bad at all, but okay, on the 90D we have 1080, doesn't look much better than the clips shot on the EOS R. A clear advantage of shooting 120 frames per second is of course that we get a buttery, creamy, awesome slow motion, and it slows down compared to real-time speed to 25%. And another advantage is when we put the file in the software, it's already slowed down. But here's my extra tip. When you put a 120 frames per second file video in Resolve or Premiere Pro, yes, it's slowed down automatically, immediately. But if you go to the clip attributes, you can see that it's by default a 30 frames per second clip. So what's wrong with it? Well, if you have to use it on a 24 frames per second timeline, you'll better take that 30 frames per second clip, slow motion, already slowed down, and conform it to the 24 frames per second timeline. That way it will look even better. Now, some disadvantages of shooting 120 frames per second with the Canon EOS R and the Canon 90D. You lose the dual pixel autofocus. Well, actually you lose any kind of autofocus when you're shooting in 120 frames per second with these cameras. So once you focus on the subject before shooting, then you click the rec button and that's it. It's gonna stay like that. So if the subject moves away or closer to the camera, it will be out of focus. Same thing if you move closer or away from the subject with your camera, it will be out of focus. Still, you can make things do when you're shooting 120 frames per second, but of course there are some shots that you can't shoot just because you lose the possibility of focusing. So what's the solution? Well, you can shoot in slow motion in 60 frames per second, and let's see what it looks like. Alright, it's not as smooth and slow like in battery like the 120 frames per second one, but it's good enough. I mean, when you watch a movie or a slow motion sequence, how many times do you ask, is this 120 or 60? I think it's 60. Or this is 120. Most of the times you don't really care. If what you're watching looks good, it works. That's it. If you shoot slow motion in 60 frames per second and you like the results, well then do it in 60 frames per second and Bob's your uncle. The main disadvantage is that it's not as slow as the 120 frames per second, because 120 frames per second is like 25% of speed. With 60 frames per second, you can slow it down, and you have to slow it down in post only to 50%. Not more, otherwise the footage will look like jittery and weird. And again, that's something you have to do in post. On Resolve, I do it in a very easy way. When I put the clip in Resolve, I just go to the clip attributes and conform it to 24 frames per second or 23.976. Something like that. But anyway, and it slows down to 50%. After talking about the disadvantages, let's see one of the advantages. You do have the dual pixel autofocus, meaning that you don't have to worry if the subject moves away or closer to the camera. It will stay in focus. Okay, so we saw 120 frames per second and 60 frames per second for slow motion on the Canon EOS R and the Canon 90D. Now, we do have another option. Well, actually we have two options. Yes, one is to shoot in 30 frames per second. Hey, oh my god, did I say 30 frames per second for a cinematic video? Yes. You shoot in 30 frames per second and then you do some work in post and apply something called optical flow. That'll be a little bit long to explain, but if you're interested, here's the video. I'm gonna put a card right here and check it out, the way you can shoot slow motion in 30 frames per second so that you can make it look like it's like 120 frames per second, and it's actually not. Does it make sense? I guess. 30 frames per second. Well, okay, and there's another way. If you just shoot in 30 frames per second and then you put it in the software, Premiere or Resolve, and you just conform it to the 24 frames per second timeline, the footage will slow down a tiny little bit so that you can't even tell whether it's slow motion or not, but it gives a very particular effect. So when should you use it? Well, it depends. Well, if we talk about the one with the optical flow thing, check out my video I told you about earlier and see if it works for you or not, because the effect is very particular. But for the one in 30 frames per second conformed to a 24 frames per second timeline, it's really a tiny little bit slow. And you can use that effect in a situation where you don't really want the sequence to be a slow motion, but you want it to look particular, like different, not a regular 24 frames per second and not the 30 frames per second, like something that for some reasons doesn't look 100% real, like if it was a dream or something like that. Or another situation is that if you shoot with a Canon EOS R and an EFS lens, you don't have the option to shoot 120 or 60 frames per second. So you can try to make things do with 30 and slow it down in post. As I told you, like either with the optical flow or conforming the 30 frames per second to the 24 frames per second timeline. This is all I wanted to show you today, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash the like button, subscribe if you aren't already, and I'll see you guys in the next video.